What's the greatest thing that has happened for you since you've been on The Voice? That's a no-brainer, right? I met my fiance here. Did somebody say fashion?
There are love stories that play out in the headlines, and then there are the ones that live in the quiet spaces between them, in the pauses, the phone calls nobody hears, the moments that never make it onto a magazine cover. The story of Gwen Stefani and Blake Shelton has always appeared to belong to the first category. We watched it unfold in real time, two celebrities, fresh from the wreckage of failed marriages, finding each other under the bright studio lights of a television set. It seemed almost too convenient, too perfectly timed for public consumption. And for years, that was the version most of us accepted. But Gwen Stefani has been sitting on something. Not a scandal. Not a confession. Something quieter than that, and in many ways, far more powerful. In recent conversations, she has begun pulling back a curtain that she kept firmly shut for years, revealing a dimension of Blake Shelton that the public, despite years of watching him crack jokes on television, hearing his voice pour out of country radio stations, and seeing his face splashed across tabloids, has never truly been allowed to see. What she describes is not the larger-than-life country star. It is the man behind that image. And the difference, she suggests, is everything. To understand what Gwen is finally saying, you have to understand where both of them were before any of this began. Not the curated version, not the press releases and the carefully worded statements, but the raw, unfiltered reality of two people whose lives were quietly disintegrating even as they showed up to work and smiled for the cameras. Gwen Stefani had spent the better part of 2 decades building something she believed was permanent. Her marriage to Gavin Rossdale, the British rock star she had fallen for long before either of them could have anticipated where their careers would take them, was the cornerstone of her personal identity. She had her music, her fashion, her sons, Kingston, Zuma, and Little Apollo, but Gavin was the anchor. Or so she believed. When that anchor turned out to be an illusion, when the betrayal she could not have imagined became undeniable reality, the collapse was total. She has described the period that followed as one in which she genuinely did not know how to keep functioning. Getting out of bed felt like an achievement. Being a mother, which had always come naturally to her, suddenly required enormous effort because so much of her emotional energy was being consumed by grief, by shock, by the particular devastation of learning that the life you thought you were living was not the life that was actually happening. Blake Shelton was navigating his own version of that collapse. His divorce from Miranda Lambert, a woman who had been his partner not just in life but in professional identity, they were country music's golden couple, two voices that belonged together in the cultural imagination of an entire genre, left him adrift in ways he struggled to articulate. He returned to his ranch in Oklahoma, to the land and the quiet that had always been his refuge, but even there the silence felt wrong. He has spoken about drinking too much during that period, about the particular aimlessness that follows when a life you spent years constructing suddenly has no shape. He was not broken in a way that showed on the surface. Blake Shelton has always been the man with the easy laugh, the quick joke, the disarming charm that makes people feel immediately comfortable. But underneath that, he was searching for something solid to hold on to. Neither of them was looking for love. That detail matters, because it changes the nature of what happened next. When Gwen joined the panel of NBC's The Voice in the fall of 2014, she and Blake were cordial colleagues and nothing more. She has since admitted, with characteristic honesty, that she barely knew who he was when she signed on. He was a big name in a musical world she had never particularly inhabited, country radio, Nashville, the whole cultural universe that exists largely parallel to the pop and rock landscape she had spent her career in. She knew enough to be professional. She did not know enough to be impressed. And Blake, for his part, was hardly bowled over. He was friendly, funny, exactly the person you would expect him to be on camera. But there was no spark, no sense of destiny, no move-a-moment recognition. What there was, eventually, was shared pain. And shared pain, it turns out, is one of the most powerful forces of human connection that exists. Gwen has described the moment the dynamic shifted not as romantic but as almost accidental. They were both going through their separations. They were both, in different ways, pretending to be fine in public while falling apart in private. And at some point, in the particular intimacy that develops between people who work closely together over long hours, they stop pretending with each other. She has talked about the emails, long, unguarded, emotionally honest emails that she would send to Blake during that period, not because she had romantic intentions but because she needed somewhere to put the feelings that had nowhere else to go. He wrote back. He kept writing back. And in those exchanges, something began to take shape that neither of them had planned. Blake has said that he woke up one day and realized she was the only thing he cared about. He has framed it not as falling in love but as something more gradual and more fundamental, a slow reorientation of everything that mattered to him, until she was at the center of it. That is not the language of a rebound. That is the language of someone describing a transformation they did not entirely understand while it was happening. By the time their relationship became public knowledge in the fall of 2015, the world had a ready-made narrative waiting for it. Two celebrities, both recently divorced, both high-profile, both presumably lonely, of course they had turned to each other. It was the kind of story that writes itself, and the tabloid industry was delighted to write it. The photographs at Halloween, the official confirmation from their representatives, the subsequent duet on The Voice that left audiences visibly emotional, all of it fed into a narrative that was simultaneously true and somehow incomplete. What was missing from that narrative is what Gwen is now, carefully and on her own terms, beginning to fill in. She has spoken in recent interviews about a moment in the early days of their relationship, a moment she has described as the one that genuinely surprised her, the one she did not see coming from a man who projects the kind of confident, self-assured ease that Blake Shelton typically projects. It happened during a period when she was struggling, when the demands of 3 young children, a fractured sense of self, and a very new and uncertain relationship were pressing down on her simultaneously. She was pulling back. Not deliberately, not as a strategic move, but because she was overwhelmed, and when she is overwhelmed, she retreats. She always has. She expected Blake to push. To call repeatedly. To do what people typically do when they sense someone they care about withdrawing, apply pressure, demand reassurance, make the moment about their own anxiety. Instead, he did something she has described as almost disarmingly simple. He reached for the language he knew she understood better than any other. He sent her a piece of music. Not a finished song. Not something polished and presentable. A rough melody, a few lines of lyrics, raw and imperfect and entirely sincere. It was his way of saying, I see you. I understand how you communicate. I am not going to force this into a shape that does not fit you. For Gwen, who has poured the defining experiences of her life into music since she was a teenager in Anaheim, forming what would become No Doubt, it was the most intimate gesture anyone had ever made toward her. It was not grand. It was not expensive. It required no audience. It simply demonstrated that he had been paying attention, real attention, the kind that cost something, and that he was willing to meet her in the place where she felt most herself. She responded, in the only way that felt natural to her, by finishing the lyrics. And in that quiet musical exchange, carried out over text messages with no cameras present and no publicists aware it was happening, something fundamental between them was sealed. But this was not a single gesture in isolation. What Gwen has come to understand, and what she is now articulating with the particular clarity that comes from years of reflection, is that the moment with the music was not an exception to who Blake Shelton is. It was an illustration of it. She describes a man whose public persona, the big, jovial, beer-drinking country boy who lights up every room and fills every silence with a punchline, coexists with something far more attentive and emotionally intelligent than that image typically suggests. The people who know Blake only from television know one version of him. They know the entertainer. What Gwen has had access to, and what she is now gently insisting that the world deserves to understand, is the version that exists when the cameras are off and the performance is no longer required. She talks about the way he inserted himself into her sons' lives, not dramatically, not in a way designed to be noticed or appreciated, but steadily and without fanfare. He showed up. That is the phrase she returns to most often when she talks about this. He showed up in the ordinary, unglamorous sense of the phrase, at soccer games, at school events, at dinner tables, helping with homework that was probably well below the level of anyone's idea of quality entertainment. He learned what each of her boys needed from him individually, because children are not interchangeable, and he understood that. Kingston, Zuma, and Apollo each had a different relationship with the enormous change that had come into their lives, and Blake, without being instructed, without being asked, found his way into each of those relationships differently. Before he proposed to Gwen, he asked her sons for their blessing. This detail, which has emerged quietly in conversations over the years, tells you something significant about the man's character. He did not have to do that. Nobody required it of him. It was not the expected gesture. The expectation, if anything, would have been simply that the children would adapt to whatever the adults decided. But Blake believed their feelings were not secondary to the decision. He believed they were part of it. Gwen has also spoken, with increasing openness in recent years, about the deeper spiritual dimension of their relationship, a dimension she considers not incidental but foundational, the thing beneath the thing, the element that explains why this particular pairing, which looked so improbable on paper, has proven so enduring in reality. Faith has been the constant thread in Gwen's life since childhood. She grew up in a devout Catholic household in Anaheim, and whatever transformations her career put her through, the ska punk years, the pop reinvention, the fashion empire, the television presence, that foundational faith remained. It shaped how she processed difficulty, how she understood her own story, and how she eventually came to interpret even the most painful chapter of her life, the collapse of her marriage, as something that, in some larger sense she was still working to understand, was part of a plan she had not written. Blake came to their relationship from a different place spiritually. He had grown up in a Christian home in Oklahoma, but the years of Nashville success, touring, and the particular lifestyle that surrounds that kind of career had put distance between him and the faith of his childhood. He had not abandoned it exactly. But he had not been living in it, either. What has happened between them, Gwen says, is something she did not engineer and did not anticipate. As their relationship deepened, as the realities of their shared life, the blended family, the public scrutiny, the ordinary daily challenges that exist in every household but feel heavier when you are living them in public, began to stack up, faith became the language they reached for together. Blake began accompanying her to church. He began engaging with the questions she had always lived with as genuine questions, not ritual. And gradually, she says, something in him reopened that had been closed for a long time. She has called him a spiritual intervention. That phrase is worth pausing on. She does not mean it as hyperbole. She means that at the moment in her life when she was most lost, when the person she thought she knew best had turned out to be someone else entirely, when her sense of herself as a woman and a partner had been devastated, Blake appeared. And she has come to understand his arrival not as luck or coincidence or the particular randomness of two people ending up on the same television program at the same time, but as something placed deliberately in her path by a force she trusts more than she trusts circumstance. That shared understanding, that their relationship is not just between two people but involves something larger than both of them, is, she says, the real reason it has held. Other celebrity relationships fracture under the pressure of public attention, of scheduling conflicts, of the fundamental difficulty of two strong personalities with established careers and distinct creative identities trying to build a common life. What she and Blake have that she did not have before, and that she believes he did not have before either, is a foundation that is not dependent on circumstances going well. When things are hard, and she does not pretend things are never hard, there is something underneath that does not move. That is what she means when she talks about faith as the center of their life together.